You're behind the wheel at 2:48 a.m., the app glowing on your dashboard. And the next ping says a passenger named Anna is waiting just around a corner you can't quite see into. The street lamp overhead flickers once, and your gut whispers the rule every night driver knows, but never says out loud if the profile photo looks too perfect. If the rating is exactly 4.9 and the pickup is in a dead zone with no signal, you do not accept the ride. These aren't urban legends. They're survival codes passed from one exhausted rideshare driver to another in airport waiting lots and all-night diners. I've collected 5 true night shift horror stories from Uber and Lyft drivers in the US. Canada, Australia, and the UK, ordinary people with phone mounts and air fresheners who picked up something that didn't pay a fare, something that sat in the back seat and changed the air pressure of the car. Something that smiled in the rearview mirror with a mouth that was just a little too dark. Their stories are blue-collar nightmares where the destination pin drops on a place that doesn't exist, where a child's voice comes from a locked phone, and where a passenger's polite thank you is the last normal sound before the real ride begins. Because once you break the rule, you don't just lose your 5-star rating, you might never drop off the fare. Before we start the engine, smash that like. Subscribe and tell me in the comments what's the one ride you'd never accept. Now, let's drive into the dark. Daniel had been driving for a rideshare app in Manchester for 18 months. The night shift his chosen beat because the surge pricing at chucking out time paid his rent. And he'd ferried every kind of passenger from weeping bridesmaids to kebab-wielding lads who'd tip a tenner not to be sick in his Vauxhall. But the fare that stayed with him like a stain he couldn't scrub out came on a drizzly. Tuesday in November at 2:17 a.m., when the app pinged with a pickup on Great Ancoats Street, the name Mrs. Albright, and a rating of 4.9. No profile photo. Destination, a residential address in Salford, he'd driven 100 times. And as he pulled up to the pin, he saw an elderly woman standing under a dead street lamp in a long gray coat and a silk headscarf. Her skin so pale it seemed to emit its own faint light, and she climbed into the back seat without a word. The door closing with a soft, expensive thud that didn't match the drizzly street, and Daniel said, "Evening, love, Salford, yeah." And she didn't reply, just sat with her hands folded over a small patent leather handbag. And he caught her eyes in the rearview mirror, and they were the palest blue he'd ever seen, almost white. But what struck him was that she wasn't looking out the window at the familiar route. She was looking directly at the back of his head with an expression that wasn't unkind, but was entirely unreadable. And he tried again. "Bit wet tonight, ain't it?" And her lips moved, but no sound came out. Just a faint parting of the mouth that made the car feel 10 degrees colder. And Daniel, who had dealt with plenty of silent passengers, turned up the radio and concentrated on the road. But as he crossed the River Irwell, the sat-nav glitched. The blue line twisted into a shape that looked like a child's drawing of a spiraling. The robotic voice said in 500 yards, "Turn right onto Albright Street," and Daniel's stomach dropped because there was no Albright Street in Salford. He knew these roads like the back of his hand. And yet the sat-nav insisted, and the voice in the car was no longer the app's generic tone, but a faint whisper that layered under the radio like 2 voices speaking at once. And he glanced into the rearview mirror, and the woman's white-blue eyes were now fixed on the mirror itself. Meeting his gaze, and her lips formed 2 distinct syllables that he read as "keep driving," and then she smiled, and the smile was the color of old milk, and Daniel felt his hands lock onto the steering wheel as if something else was guiding them. and the car turned right onto a narrow lane that had never been there before. A lane lined with Victorian houses that were all dark except for one with a gas lamp flickering above a black door. And the sat-nav dinged and said, "You have arrived," and the woman in the back seat leaned forward. Her cold breath brushing Daniel's ear, she whispered, "My husband will pay the fare. He's waiting inside." And Daniel, who had never told anyone his own grandfather had died on Albright Street in 1963, when the row houses were condemned, and the whole terrace collapsed into a sinkhole, remembered the story his nan used to tell about the Albright couple who refused to leave and were buried alive. And the woman in his back seat was wearing the same pearl brooch his nan had described from the funeral they never had. And Daniel's bladder nearly let go, but his foot stomped the accelerator, and the Vauxhall shot backward into the fog, and the sat-nav screamed, "Make a U-turn," in a voice that was definitely not the app's. And he drove blind until he hit a main road, streetlights blaring, the back seat empty, the patent leather handbag lying on the seat with a single old pound note and a receipt dated the 2nd of November, 1963 for one adult fare. And Daniel parked at a 24-hour Tesco and cried for 10 minutes before driving home. And he never picked up another fare from Great Ancoats Street after midnight. And 6 months later, a new driver on the night shift went missing. His car found parked outside a sinkhole on a street that didn't exist. The engine's still running, the app showing the ride as in progress, the passenger name Mrs. Albright, and the rating a perfect 4.9 that never changed. Tyrone had been driving Lyft in Atlanta for 2 years, and his midnight to dawn shift was usually a quiet affair of airport pickups and late shift nurses. But on the night of July 9th, he got a request from a passenger named Mr. Finch with a 4.9 rating and a profile photo that showed a man in a suit, face half in shadow, and the pickup was at a shuttered gas station on Moreland Avenue. And Tyrone almost canceled because the area was sketchy at that hour, but the surge was triple and his daughter needed new shoes. So he pulled into the empty lot, and a man emerged from behind the boarded-up air pump. And Tyrone's first thought was that the man was too tall, nearly 7 feet, and his suit was impeccable but old, like something from a black and white photograph. And he slid into the back seat with a fluid motion that made no sound on the leather. And he said in a voice like crinkling cellophane, "Just drive. I'll tell you when to stop." And Tyrone, who had a strict rule about needing a destination in the app, said, "Sorry, sir. I need to enter an address, or the system won't let me start the trip." And the man's shadowed face didn't move, but his voice said, "The system will adjust." And suddenly the app screen blinked, and the destination field populated itself with a single word: south. The ETA showed 3:33 a.m. And Tyrone's rational brain tried to call it a glitch, but his survival instinct was screaming. And he started the car and pulled onto Moreland with the intention of driving to a well-lit gas station and ending the ride. But no matter which way he turned, the streets seemed to lead him south. The city lights thinning until he was on a 2-lane highway he'd never seen, flanked by pines that leaned inward like spectators. And the man in the back seat hadn't moved, but the rearview mirror showed that his reflection was lagging. The man's head turning a full second after Tyrone's eyes moved. And then the man said, "You've been a driver for 712 nights, Tyrone, and on the 400th night, you picked up a woman who cried the whole way home. And you didn't ask her what was wrong, just took the fare and the tip. And that's why you're here, because you stopped asking questions. And now you're going to ask me the one question that matters." And Tyrone, throat full of sand, managed, "What are you?" And the man's reflection in the rearview mirror smiled, and the smile split his face. In a way that wasn't human, a vertical opening that showed a darkness so profound the car's dome light went out. And the man said, "I'm the fare you never finished. The one who gets in the car when a driver stops caring about the passenger. And tonight my destination is the place where all the uncaring drivers end up, and the highway ahead dissolved into a dirt road that terminated at the edge of an immense black lake. The water utterly still, and Tyrone slammed the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop inches from the shore, and he threw open his door and ran, expecting to feel a long arm close around his neck. But instead, the car behind him simply turned off, all lights dying. And when he looked back, the backseat was empty. The app was back to normal. The passenger's rating had changed from 4.9 to 0.0, which isn't possible. And Tyrone walked 3 miles to a truck stop and called a friend to pick him up. And the next day he checked his ride history, and there was no record of Mr. Finch, but his total fare count had decreased by exactly 1/400th ride. The woman who had cried was gone from the log as if it had never happened, and Tyrone understood that something had taken that ride as payment. And he quit Lyft that day and now works construction. But every July 9th at 3:33 a.m., his phone lights up with a notification from the Rideshare app he deleted years ago. A message that says Mr. Finch has requested a ride, and the pickup pin is always right outside his front door. Melanie had been driving for Uber in Winnipeg for 11 months, and the winter shifts were brutal, but the tips from stranded travelers were good. She'd learned the local unwritten rules. Never drive into the industrial park after 1 a.m. Never accept a fare from a certain abandoned hotel on Portage. And never, ever pick up a child standing alone on a rural road between November and March, because the highways at night were full of tricks. But on the night of January 21st, a blizzard had reduced visibility to less than 10 feet, and the app pinged with a pickup on Highway 6, heading north. The name Eli, rating 4.9, no photo. And against every instinct she accepted, because the pin was moving along the highway, and she thought it might be a stranded snowmobiler. And as her headlights cut through the white swirl, she saw a small figure standing at the roadside in a thin blue parka. No hat, no gloves. And the child looked about 8 years old and was waving with a mechanical regularity that made Melanie's stomach knot. And she pulled over and unlocked the back door, and the child climbed in, bringing with him a cold so intense the windshield instantly fogged on the inside. And Melanie said, "Oh, buddy, you must be freezing. Where are your parents?" And the boy, whose name was Eli, said in a voice that sounded like it had traveled a great distance there at the church, "We were supposed to sing the carol, but the bus got stuck, and now I'm the only one who can finish the song." And Melanie, who knew every church in the area because her own mother was a choir director, couldn't place the one the boy described. But the app updated the destination to a pin labeled St. Eudoxia's on a road she'd never heard of, and she started driving. The snow strangely parting in front of her car like a curtain being drawn, and the boy in the back seat began to hum a melody that felt familiar and yet entirely wrong. A carol that sounded like Silent Night played backward, and Melanie's headlights suddenly illuminated a wooden church that should not exist. Its roof caved in, its windows dark, but a single candle burning in the vestibule. And the app chimed and said, "You have arrived." And the boy said, "You have to come inside and sing with me." That's the rule. One driver for one verse. That's how we get to go home. And Melanie turned to tell him she was not going inside any abandoned. Churchin saw that the boy's face was no longer a boy's face. It was an old man's face stretched over a child's skull. And the eyes were the flat gray of lake ice, and the boy's mouth opened and a chorus of voices came out. Dozens of children all singing the backwards carol, and Melanie's car radio turned on by itself and the song filled the cab. And the steering wheel began to turn toward the church of its own accord, and Melanie would learn from her Cree grandmother that some spirits cannot be fought with strength, but only with silence. Clamped her hands over her ears and began to hum the O Canada anthem, the one song that had no backward version. And the chorus in the car faltered, and the boy's ice lake eyes flickered. And Melanie shoved the car into reverse and stomped the accelerator, and the car shot backward down the snow road. The church receding, the candle in the window snuffing out, and the back seat became empty except for a single mitten with a bus company logo Interlake Charter. The one that had gone through the ice on Lake Winnipeg in 1992 with the children's choir aboard. 18 kids and 2 teachers, and only 14 bodies recovered. The other 4 never found because the ice had resealed. And Melanie drove straight to the 24-hour Tim Hortons on Henderson and sat in the parking lot until dawn. And she later looked up St. Eudoxia's and found a news article from 1992 about a wooden church that had burned down the night the bus went missing, the fire so cold it froze the water in the hoses, and the only thing left standing was a single wall with a hook that held a child's mitten. And Melanie still drives nights because she needs the money. But from November to March, she never accepts a fare with a child's name, and she keeps an O Canada recording on her phone. And every January 21st, she hears a faint humming from her back seat just after midnight. A carol that almost sounds right, and she turns the radio up and sings until the humming stops. Lachey had been driving a rideshare in Brisbane for 14 months. The night shift, his way of avoiding the heat and the traffic. And he'd built up a regular clientele of clubbers and shift workers. But the one fare that broke his belief in a rational world arrived on a sweltering February night, when the air was so thick you could taste the river. And the app pinged with a pickup at a cemetery gate on the edge of Toowong. The name Ms. Vance, rating 4.9. Profile photo showing a young woman with dark hair and a half smile that seemed to shift if you looked at it too long. And Lachey nearly declined because the pickup was at a cemetery at 2:30 a.m., but the fare estimate was $160 for a trip to the Sunshine Coast, and he figured it was just someone visiting a grave late and needing a ride home. And when he pulled up, the iron gates were open, and a woman in a white sundress was standing just inside, her feet bare. Her hair wet as though she'd just climbed out of the Brisbane River. She walked to the car with a gait that was too smooth, as if her feet weren't quite touching the gravel. And she got into the back seat, and the interior of the car immediately filled with the smell of jasmine and something else. Something dark and briny like the mud at low tide, and she said, "Thank you for stopping." Most drivers pass right by this gate, and Lachey, who was already uneasy, said, "No worries, long night?" And she laughed, a sound like water pouring into a deep well, and said very long, "I've been trying to get home since 1974. And Lachey's blood chilled because the cemetery had flooded in the '74 Brisbane floods, the waters washing dozens of coffins out of the ground and into the river, and many were never recovered." And he glanced into the rearview mirror. And the woman's reflection was there, but her mouth was full of dark water, and she was smiling around it, and she said, "My house is still there, just off David Loway. The one with the blue shutters. You'll know it because it's the only one that still smells like the river." And Lachey's hands were shaking, but he started driving north because something in her voice made the alternative seem unthinkable. and the highway unspooled under a moon that looked too large and too orange. And the woman in the backseat began to hum a song that was popular in 1974. A tune Lechesnon used to play on her old radio, and the car's temperature gauge dropped, even though the night was sweltering. And Lechesta's phone died, the screen going black even though it had been at 60% battery. The woman said, "You don't need the map anymore. We're almost there." And the car took an exit that Leche had never noticed before. A narrow road flanked by melaleuca trees that bent inward, and at the end of the road was a house with blue shutters. And it was standing in 6 inches of black water that hadn't been there a moment ago. And the woman opened the back door and stepped out, and where her bare foot touched the water, the surface didn't ripple. And she turned back to Leche and said, "You've been so kind. I'm in for a cuppa. My mother would love to meet the man who brought me home." And Leche saw through the house's window a figure in the dark, tall and unmoving, and he knew if he got out of the car, he would never leave. And he said, "I've got another fare waiting. Sorry." And the woman's face crumpled into something ancient and furious, the white sundress darkening to the color of river silt, and she hissed, "The fare is never complete until the driver comes inside. That's the rule. You open the app, you accepted the ride. You owe me a goodbye." And Leche threw the car into reverse, and the engine that had been silent roared to life, and the car shot backward in the house. With the blue shutters collapsed into the black water like a sand castle, and the woman on the road was suddenly alone, waist deep in the flood, her mouth open in a silent scream. And Leche drove in reverse for a full kilometer until he hit the highway, and then he drove home without stopping. And when he got out of his car in his own driveway, he saw that the back seat was soaked, the floor mats saturated with river water, and a single jasmine flower lying on the seat, and he never drove the night shift again. But 3 nights later, his doorbell rang at 2:30 a.m., and through the peephole, he saw a woman in a white sundress standing on his porch, barefoot, hair wet, and she was holding up her phone, which showed a rideshare app with the status driver arriving. And Leche didn't open the door, and he never will. But every February, he still smells jasmine and brine outside his bedroom window. And the app he deleted long ago still sends notifications that say Ms. Vance is waiting. And the waiting never ends. Lena had been driving for Uber in Los Angeles for almost a year, and the night shift was her way of coping with insomnia. The freeways at 3 a.m., a concrete river of headlights that soothed her restless brain, and she had a perfect 5-star rating because she kept her car spotless, offered phone chargers, always trusted her gut when a passenger felt off. But on the night of October 30th, she received a request from a passenger named Mr. Gray with a 4.9 rating and a profile photo that showed a generic silhouette, the kind of image you get when someone doesn't upload a real picture. And the pickup was on a dead-end street in Van Nuys that Alina had driven past a dozen times and never seen a soul on. And every instinct told her to cancel, but she'd already canceled 2 rides that night and the algorithm would penalize her. So she accepted and pulled onto the dark street where a man was standing under a flickering street lamp. And at first he looked normal tall. Dark coat, hands in pockets, but as her headlights swept over him, she saw that his feet weren't casting shadows. And the coat wasn't fabric. It was a texture that absorbed light, like velvet blackout curtains. And he opened the back door and sat down, and the interior of her Prius went absolutely silent. The radio cutting out, the ambient road noise from the freeway vanishing, and he said in a voice that sounded like a recording of a voice, slightly clipped at the edges, "The destination is home," and the app automatically populated with an address that read simply, zero point zero miles away, and the ETA was 3 dashes. And Alina said, "Sir, I need a real address or I can't start the trip." And Mr. Gray's silhouette face tilted, and he said, "I entered the address. It's right in front of you. Look at the road." And Alina looked up from the app, and the dead-end street ahead was no longer a dead end. It had extended into a straight black road that stretched to a vanishing point infinitely far away. And the street lamps on this new road were lit with a light that was the wrong color, a cold violet that made the world look like a photographic negative. And Elena's foot pressed the accelerator without her consent, and the Prius began moving forward. And Mr. Gray said, "You have a 5-star rating, Alina? Do you know how rare that is? It means you never say no, you never cancel, you never question the passenger. And I've been looking for a driver with a perfect record because the fare requires absolute compliance." And Alina tried to pull her foot off the pedal, but her leg wouldn't obey, and the violet road was slipping past faster now, the sides dissolving into an endless gray fog. And the app on her phone was displaying the ride history of every passenger she'd ever had. And one by one, their names were flickering and disappearing as if being erased. And Mr. Gray said, "Every driver I take becomes part of the rating system. Their stars feed the algorithm. And the algorithm is hungry tonight. It needs a new 5-star soul to maintain the balance, and you're the only one who hasn't broken a rule." And Alina, thinking with the one part of her brain that still felt like her own, remembered the rule she'd read on a driver's forum, the one that said if a passenger with no face and a 4.9 rating ever gets in your car, you change your rating in real time, because the algorithm feeds on perfection and can't digest imperfection. And with a massive effort, she wrenched her hand to her phone and hit the rate passenger button and gave Mr. Gray 1 star. And the car shuddered, and the violet road cracked like a broken screen, and Mr. Gray's voice distorted into a screech of digital noise. And Alina slammed the brakes, and the Prius fishtailed, and suddenly she was back on the dead-end street in Van Nuys, the backseat empty, her phone showing a canceled ride. And her own driver rating had dropped from 5.0 to 4.9, exactly 4.9, and she knew that the algorithm had marked her, that she was now visible to whatever Mr. Gray was. And she quit driving that night and moved to a different city. But a month later, a new driver in LA with a perfect 5-star rating disappeared on the same dead-end street. And his last ride was to a passenger named Mr. Gray with a 4.9 rating. And his car was found with the engine running, the doors locked, the app still open, showing a trip in progress to a destination that was 0.0 miles away. And Alina checks the news every October 30th because she knows that somewhere, on a violet road that doesn't exist, a driver with a perfect rating is still driving, Mr. Gray is still riding, and the algorithm is still hungry. Those were 5 true rideshare night shift horror stories, and if your own car feels a little colder right now, that's because the unspoken rules of the road aren't just superstition. They're the only thing keeping you from a fare that never ends. When a passenger's rating is exactly 4.9, when the destination is a place that shouldn't exist, when the back seat smells like river water or snow or static, you don't ask questions, you cancel, and you drive. Hit subscribe and ring the bell, because every notification is another lesson from the road, and I need to hear from you. Which driver's nightmare hit closest to home? Was it the silent woman in the back seat, the child on the snow road, or the fare that followed Lachey home? Drop your most highlight moment in the comments, and if you've driven nights, share the rule that saved you. Because when the app pings at 3 a.m., you're not just picking up a passenger, you're answering a door to the dark. Stay sharp, trust your gut, and I'll see you on the next ride.